Tonight we're pulling back a curtain you didn't know was there. You're about to step into a small wooden schoolhouse in Smet, Dakota Territory, on a frigid winter evening in 1883. The air smells like wood smoke and damp wool. Outside, the prairie wind howls against the walls. Inside, families are packed shoulder to shoulder on benches, their breath making small clouds in the lamplight. You know Laura Ingalls Wilder. You've read her books. You've seen her face on covers, heard her stories read aloud in classrooms across America. She's the little girl in the sunbonnet, the pioneer sweetheart who taught generations about hard work, family values, and the frontier spirit. Her father, Charles Ingalls, Pa, is the fiddle-playing hero who built homes with his bare hands, who hunted to feed his family, who made everything feel safe even when the world was falling apart. But tonight, you're not meeting that Pa. Tonight, you're meeting the Pa who stood on a makeshift stage and smeared burnt cork across his face. The Pa who performed in a Blackface minstrel show while his 15-year-old daughter Laura watched from the audience delighted. The Pa who became part of a racist entertainment tradition so pervasive that it infected even the most isolated corners of the American frontier. And 60 years later, Laura chose to write it all down. She chose to immortalize that moment in Little Town on the Prairie, presenting it as wholesome family fun without a single word of critique. She gave that scene to millions of children, and for 77 years it sat there in the pages waiting. In 2018, the waiting ended. The Association for Library Service to Children voted 12-0 to strip Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from a major children's literature award. The decision was unanimous. The name was changed immediately. This is the story of how we got there. This is the story of what happened in that schoolhouse, what it meant, and why it still matters. This is about the gap between the myth we were sold and the truth that was always hiding in plain sight. You're standing in the schoolhouse now. Feel the wooden bench beneath you, hard and cold. The room is dim, lit only by a few oil lamps hanging from the rafters. Their flames flicker, casting long shadows that dance across the walls. You can smell the lamp oil, sharp and acrid, mixing with the scent of wet wool from the coats piled by the door. And this is the Friday Night Literary Society, one of the few entertainments available in this harsh, isolated place. For months, the people of Smet have been trapped by winter, buried under snow, cut off from the outside world. They survived what would later be called the hard winter. 6 months when trains couldn't get through and food ran dangerously low. Now, the community gathers for a few hours of relief. Recitations, debates, musical performances, anything to break the suffocating monotony of prairie life. Tonight's entertainment is special. Tonight, Charles Ingalls and 4 other men from town are putting on a show. They've been rehearsing for weeks. The community is buzzing with anticipation. You watch as the men file onto the stage, and then you see it. Their faces are black. Not naturally black, more but covered in burnt cork and grease, the makeup smeared unevenly across their skin, leaving dark stains in the creases around their eyes and mouths. They're wearing ragged clothes, deliberately torn and patched, part of the costume. One man carries a Jew's harp, another has a mouth organ, a third holds a pair of bones, wooden rhythm instruments that clack together. Charles Ingalls stands among them, his face blackened, his familiar whiskers slicked down with grease and tucked behind his coat collar so they won't show. The man you know as Pa, the man who played the fiddle by the fire, the man who built houses and told stories and made his daughters feel safe. He's in blackface. The music starts. The men begin to sing the Skidmore Guard, a popular hit of the time, a blackface minstrel song written to mock black militia groups. Well, the lyrics went like this. "Oh, talk about your Mulligan Guards. These darkies can't be beat. We march in time and cut a shine. Just watch these darkies' feet." The audience laughs. They clap along, children giggle. 15-year-old Laura Ingalls sits with her mother and sisters, watching her father perform, and she remembers this moment as joyful. There's no record of discomfort, no hint of moral questioning. It's just entertainment, wholesome family fun in a frontier town. But here's what you need to understand. There were virtually no black people in Smet. The census shows the town was more than 99% white. The racism on display tonight isn't reactive. It's not based on actual interactions with black neighbours or competition for jobs. This racism is ideological, cultural, imported from the East and embraced as normal, respectable entertainment. Newspapers from the era document over 200 blackface minstrel performances in frontier towns just like this one. Travelling troupes came through, local amateur groups formed, churches held minstrel shows as fundraisers, schools included them in holiday programmes. The 4th of July celebration in Smet, just months after this literary society meeting, would feature song and dance performances by burnt cork minstrels. According to the Smet Leader newspaper, this wasn't an aberration. This was American culture. Blackface minstrelsy began in the 1820s and reached its peak in the mid to late 19th century. White performers darkened their faces with burnt cork, grease paint or shoe polish to create racist caricatures of black people. They performed exaggerated dialects, stereotyped behaviours, and demeaning songs that portrayed black people as lazy, stupid, childish, and suited only for servitude. By the time Charles Ingalls performed in Smet, minstrelsy had been the dominant American entertainment form for 40 years. The show served multiple functions. They dehumanized black people during and after slavery, making oppression seem natural and even funny. They allowed working-class white people, including recent immigrants, to assert their superiority over someone, anyone, even if that someone wasn't actually present. They mocked black aspirations during Reconstruction, when newly freed black Americans were fighting for civil rights and economic opportunity, and they made racism feel harmless, fun, acceptable in polite society. That's what you're watching tonight in Smet. That's what Charles Ingalls is participating in. That's what his daughter Laura is absorbing, the memory forming in her mind, pleasant and warm, associated with community and family and her father's talent. She's 15 years old. She's old enough to understand what's happening, but she's also a product of her time and place. There's no evidence that she questioned it then. And when she wrote about it 6 decades later, as an elderly woman looking back on her childhood, she still didn't question it. She described the scene in detail. She included the song lyrics. She wrote about how the men's feet moved, how the instruments sounded, how the audience responded. She made it charming. Soon she made it part of the tapestry of frontier life. One more quaint memory from the little town on the prairie. But she never said it was wrong. And that silence, that absence of critique, that's what made the scene so dangerous. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder wasn't just any writer. By the 1940s, she was becoming one of the most beloved children's authors in America. The Little House books were teaching millions of children what pioneer life was like, what American values were, what good families looked like. And embedded in those lessons was this, that blackface minstrelsy was normal. That good men like Prairie participated in it, that it was something to remember fondly. For 77 years, from 1941 to 2018, that scene sat in a little town on the prairie. Children read it, teachers assigned it, librarians recommended it. The books won awards. In 1954, the American Library Association created an award in Laura Ingalls Wilder's name to honour authors whose books had made a lasting contribution to children's literature. But all the while, black librarians, educators and scholars were raising concerns. They pointed out the racism in the Little House books, not just the minstrel show scene, but also the anti-Native American language, the casual white supremacy woven throughout the narratives. They talked about the harm these depictions caused to black children who encountered them. For decades, those concerns were largely ignored. But in 2018, something shifted. The Association for Library Service to Children formed a task force to review their awards program in light of the organization's core values: integrity, respect, inclusiveness, and responsiveness. They surveyed members, non-members, and stakeholders, writers, publishers, librarians. And on June 23, 2018, during the American Library Association's annual conference in New Orleans, the ALSC board voted. The vote was 12-0. the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award would be renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The change took effect immediately. In their statement, ALSC President Nina Lindsay and ALA President Jim Neal acknowledged that Wilder's works reflect dated cultural attitudes toward Indigenous people and people of colour that contradict modern acceptance, celebration, and understanding of diverse communities. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Wilder's defenders argued that she was being unfairly judged by modern standards, that her books were historically accurate, that removing her name was erasing history. Some said the decision was political correctness gone too far. Others insisted that the book should be banned entirely. But here's what the vote wasn't. It wasn't erasing Laura Ingalls Wilder. The books are still in print. They're still in libraries and classrooms. Wilder herself remains the first recipient of the award, now called the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Her literary contributions are still acknowledged. What changed was this. An organisation decided it could no longer put its name behind hers without qualification. It could no longer honour her while ignoring the harm embedded in her work. And that decision, that unanimous vote, that's where our story really begins. Because it forces us to ask questions we've been avoiding for nearly 80 years. What do we do when the stories that shaped us contain profound racism? How do we teach children about history when our most beloved historical figures participated in systemic oppression? How do we balance preservation with accountability? How do we honour literary achievement while acknowledging moral failure? And most uncomfortably, what does it mean that a good man, a man who loved his family, who worked hard, who embodied so many virtues we claim to value, also smeared his face with burnt cork and performed racist caricatures for entertainment? You're still sitting in that schoolhouse. The performance is ending. The audience is applauding. Charles Ingalls is taking his bow, his blackened face glistening with sweat in the lamplight. Laura is clapping, smiling, proud of her father. She doesn't know yet that she'll write about this moment. She doesn't know that her words will be read by millions. She doesn't know that more than a century later this single scene will become evidence in a larger reckoning about American racism, about who we honour, about what stories we tell and why. She just knows that tonight was fun, that the community came together, that her father was talented and everyone laughed, and that memory, that pleasant, uncomplicated memory, will stay with her for the rest of her life. But history isn't finished with this moment. Not yet. Because 60 years from now, Laura Ingalls Wilder will make a choice. She'll sit down at her writing desk in Mansfield, Missouri, an elderly woman looking back on her frontier childhood, and she'll decide what to include and what to leave out. She'll decide which memories matter, which stories to tell, and how to shape the past for future generations. And when she comes to this night, this winter evening in 1883, she'll decide to write it all down. Every detail, the burnt cork, the song, the laughter. She'll give it to the world without apology, and the world will read it, and love it, and pass it down to their children, until one day the world says, wait, what are we teaching? What are we honouring? What does it mean that this is in a children's book? That day came in 2018. But the story of how we got there, the story of Charles Ingalls and Laura Ingalls Wilder, and the choices they made and the culture they lived in, and the racism they perpetuated, that story starts here, in this schoolhouse, on this cold winter night, with burnt cork and music and laughter. That's the story we're telling tonight, and it's going to get complicated. It's going to make you uncomfortable. It's going to challenge what you thought you knew about beloved books and American heroes and the frontier myth. But the truth, it turns out, is messier than nostalgia. Much messier. The applause is fading. Charles Ingalls wipes the burnt cork from his face with a rag, the black smearing across his knuckles. His hands are rough, calloused from years of building and farming and failing. Outside, families bundle into coats, heading back into the frozen night, talking about what a wonderful show it was. Laura watches her father from across the room. She's 15 years old, and she knows him better than anyone. She knows the sound of his footsteps in the morning, the songs he hums when no one is listening, the way his face changes when he's about to tell them they're moving again. Tonight. She knows he was brilliant. The audience loved him. He made them laugh. He brought the community together. He's a good man. But here's what you need to understand about Charles Ingalls. Being a good man and participating in systemic racism aren't contradictions. They're the same story, the same person, the same America. This is the part that makes people uncomfortable. We want our heroes simple. We want Pa to be either the fiddle-playing father who loved his daughters, or the man in blackface mocking an entire race, one or the other. But he was both, at the same time, without conflict, and that's the truth about respectable racism. It didn't require you to be a monster. It just required you to be normal. Charles Ingalls was born in 1836, under the son of farmers who moved west looking for better land. He grew up working, learned carpentry, learned music. At 24, he married Carolyn Quiner. They settled in Wisconsin, in a log cabin he built himself. For a few years, it seemed like it might work out. But Charles had something in him, a restlessness, a belief that somewhere over the next hill there was better land, bigger opportunities, a chance to finally make something of himself. And when that restlessness took hold, nothing could stop it. Not his wife's exhaustion, not his daughter's need for stability. By 1868, when Laura was barely a year old, Charles was already talking about Kansas, free land, starting fresh. Caroline didn't want to go. She had family in Wisconsin. She had a community. But in 1868, wives didn't get a vote, so they went. And here's where the pattern starts. Charles would find land, build a house. He was genuinely skilled with his hands, start farming, play his fiddle in the evenings and make his daughters feel like everything was going to be fine. Then something would go wrong. Sometimes it was bad luck. The grasshoppers in Minnesota weren't his fault. The hard winter wasn't something he could control. But sometimes, often actually, the failures were his own doing. Take Kansas. The land Charles claimed in 1869 wasn't available for settlement. It was part of the Osage Diminished Reserve, land the federal government had explicitly promised to the Osage Nation. White settlers weren't supposed to be there. Charles knew this, or should have. But he built a house anyway, invested months of labour, money they didn't have, dreams his family couldn't afford. And in 1870, when the government enforced the treaty and told the squatters to leave, Charles lost everything. The house he'd built, the land he'd cleared, the time he'd stolen from his family's security. What did he do? Packed up the wagon, told Caroline they were moving again. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota. By the time Laura was 15, she'd lived in more places than most adults live in a lifetime. Think about what that does to a child. You're 7 years old, standing in a field watching your father plant wheat. He's telling you this crop is going to change everything. Next year there'll be money for a new stove, maybe a piano for your mother. You watch him work and you want to believe him. But you've heard this before. You've watched him make promises in Wisconsin and Kansas, in Minnesota. Watched him build and plant and hope and fail. You're 7 years old, and you're already learning that home isn't a place. It's a temporary stop before the next move. You learn not to get too attached to friends, not to invest too much hope in your father's plans, and you learn something else, something darker. Your father, despite all his failures, despite all the times he's uprooted your family and chased dreams that turned to dust, is still your father. You still love him. He still makes you feel safe when he plays the fiddle. Still carries you when you're tired. The failures don't cancel out the love. Maybe that's what makes the Schoolhouse performance so hard to grapple with. Charles Ingalls wasn't a villain. He wasn't cruel. By all accounts, he loved his daughters fiercely. He worked hard even when the work led nowhere. He served as justice of the peace, sat on the school board, fought against saloons because he believed alcohol destroyed families. He was, by the standards of his time, a good man, and he smeared burnt cork on his face and performed racist caricatures for entertainment. Both things are true, and the fact that both things are true is what makes this story so important. Because here's what respectable racism looked like on the frontier. Church fundraisers featuring minstrel shows, school programs where children performed in blackface, the doctor, the merchant, the justice of the peace participating in the entertainment that dehumanized an entire race. Nobody questioned it, not because they were all secretly hateful, but because racism had been so thoroughly woven into American culture that it felt as innocent as singing a song. That's what Laura absorbed that night. Not malice, just the quiet, pervasive message that this was normal, that good people did this, that her kind, hard-working, musical father could put on a minstrel show and it didn't contradict anything he'd taught her. Here's the most dangerous part. She never unlearned it. 60 years later, she's an old woman at her writing desk. She remembers that night, the laughter, the music, her father's feet moving in the clog dance, feeling proud of him, and she writes it down, every detail, the burnt cork, the ragged costumes, the song. She gives that scene to millions of children, and she never says it was wrong, because in her mind it wasn't wrong. It was just how things were. Part of the quaint, wholesome frontier life she was preserving, and that's the gap, the canyon, between Laura's intention and the harm her words would cause. But let's look closer at the wholesome life she was preserving. The restlessness that drove Charles Ingalls wasn't just about bad luck or crop failures. It was driven by a specific American promise, the Homestead Act, free land. And there was only one way that land could be free. It had to be taken. Charles Ingalls didn't stumble onto the Osage Diminished Reserve by accident. He was part of a wave of settlers who believed the land was theirs for the taking, simply because they were white, and the people living there were not. When the government forced the Ingalls family off the Kansas land, Charles didn't see it as a correction of theft. He saw it as bad luck, as the government breaking his heart. He never seemed to consider that the land wasn't his to begin with, and that brings us to the other people in Laura's story. The people who were there first. The people Charles Ingalls displaced, sometimes knowingly, sometimes blindly. The people Laura called savages. In Chapter 3, we're leaving the schoolhouse. We're leaving the cosy comfort of the town. We're heading out into the prairie. We're going to look at the Indian jars buried in the ground, the soldiers on the horizon, the systematic erasure of the Dakota and Osage people. Because the Blackface performance was the racism of entertainment. But the homesteading was the racism of survival, the racism of displacement. The racism that didn't just mock, it erased. And Laura wrote about that too. This is the other half of the hidden truth. The part that wasn't performed on a stage with burnt cork and laughter. The part that happened quietly, relentlessly, across a continent. The part where free land meant stolen land. The part where pioneers meant invaders. The part where Charles Ingalls, the good man who loved his daughters and played the fiddle and worked so hard, became part of a system that destroyed entire nations. And when Laura wrote about it 60 years later, she didn't see that either. She saw adventure. She saw hardship overcome. She saw her father as a hero. But she didn't see the bodies buried in the ground where he built his house. That's what we're confronting next, and it's much harder to ignore. You're standing on the prairie now, not in De Smet, not in winter. You're further south, 14 years earlier, on a different piece of land that will also end in failure. It's 1869, and Charles Ingalls is walking across Kansas tall grass, his boots crushing stems that reach his waist. The land rolls gently under a sky so big it makes you feel small. There's timber near a creek, cottonwood and oak, perfect for building. The soil looks rich. Game trails crisscross the grass. To Charles, this looks like opportunity, like a fresh start, like the place where his family will finally put down roots. There's just one problem. This land isn't his. It's not free. It's not unclaimed. It's not waiting for pioneers to civilize it. This is the Osage Diminished Reserve. 8 million acres that the United States government explicitly promised to the Osage Nation in treaties signed in 1865 and 1866. The treaties were clear. White settlers were not allowed here. This land belonged to the Osage people. Charles Ingalls knew this, or he should have. The newspapers were full of debates about the reserve. The government was negotiating with the Osage, but no sale had been finalized. No permission had been granted for settlement. But Charles built a house anyway, and he wasn't alone. By summer's end in 1869, hundreds of white families were squatting on Osage land. They were cutting Osage timber to build cabins, hunting Osage game, breaking Osage soil for farming, digging wells, planting crops, stealing, in other words. When the Osage returned from their seasonal hunts, they found their homeland occupied. The white families living in houses that shouldn't exist. Fields ploughed where buffalo had grazed. Forests cleared without permission. The Osage chiefs wrote to President Ulysses S. Grant, begging for troops to remove the squatters. They posted notices requesting the intruders leave. Many of the white settlers, Charles Ingalls among them, refused. They said they wouldn't abandon the land unless forced by military action. Think about that. Charles Ingalls, the man who would later fight against saloons because he believed they destroyed families, refused to leave land that wasn't his, even when the legal owners asked him to go. The man who had become Pa in the Little House books, the man who taught his daughters about honesty and hard work, the man who played the fiddle and made them feel safe. That man was an illegal squatter on Indigenous land. And when Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about this years later, she didn't call it theft. She called it pioneering. In Little House on the Prairie, published in 1935, Laura describes the Kansas land through her father's eyes. There were no settlers, she writes. Only Indians lived there. And then comes the line that would haunt her legacy for decades. There were no people. Only Indians lived there. Read that again. There were no people. Only Indians lived there. That sentence sat in the book for nearly 20 years before anyone at Harper & Brothers noticed what it implied. In 1952, a reader complained. The editor was shocked that not a single person had caught it. The sentence appeared to suggest Native Americans weren't human. The line was eventually revised, but the damage was done, and the revision didn't fix the deeper problem. Laura's books consistently portrayed Indigenous people as obstacles to white settlement, threats rather than rightful inhabitants of their own land. Her mother, Caroline, is depicted as openly hating Native Americans before she'd even encountered them. "I don't like Indians," she says repeatedly. As one literary critic noted, Indians become a code for everything that threatens the settled white life she wants for her daughters. Laura herself, writing as an adult in the 1930s, chose to portray her family's illegal occupation of Osage land as innocent adventure. She described her father cutting Osage timber, hunting Osage game, building on Osage soil, and framed it all as brave pioneering, not theft. Here's what she left out. She didn't write about the Osage families who'd lived on that land for generations. She didn't write about the violated treaties. She didn't write about the chiefs begging President Grant for help. She didn't write about her father's refusal to leave when asked. She didn't write about the fact that the land only seemed empty because the Osage were away on seasonal hunts when the squatters arrived. And she definitely didn't write about what happened next. In September 1870, after more than a year of illegal occupation, the federal government forced a new treaty on the Osage. Under enormous pressure and with few options, the Osage agreed to sell the diminished reserve. White settlers who'd squatted on the land, including Charles Ingalls, were given the option to purchase their claims for $1.25 per acre. Charles didn't buy, he didn't have the money. So in 1870, the Ingalls family left Kansas, not because they were forced out by the Osage, but because Charles couldn't afford to legitimize his theft. Laura remembered this differently. In her books, the family leaves because the government is moving white settlers off Indian land. She frames it as unfair, as if her family had been wronged. She doesn't frame it as justice for the Osage. This is the other half of the hidden truth. The Blackface performance in Smet. That was racism as ideology. Racism that mocked and dehumanized. But Kansas in 1869, that was racism as theft. Racism as displacement. A racism that took land, took resources, took homes from people who'd lived there for generations. That was structural racism, settler colonialism, the kind of racism that doesn't just mock, it erases. And Charles Ingalls participated in both. He smeared burnt cork on his face and performed racist caricatures of black Americans, and he built a house on stolen Osage land. He was, in other words, a completely normal white American man of his era. And that's what makes this so important. We want to believe that racism required conscious malice, that only bad people participated, that if Charles Ingalls loved his daughters and worked hard, he couldn't possibly have been part of systemic oppression. But here's the truth. Most people who participated in American racism weren't villains. So they were ordinary people making choices that seemed normal within their culture. Charles Ingalls genuinely believed the Kansas land was his for the taking. He believed it because American culture told him it was true, because the government encouraged westward expansion, because the ideology of manifest destiny taught white Americans that the continent belonged to them by divine right. He didn't think he was stealing. He thought he was pioneering. And Laura, 65 years later, still thought so too. That's how ideology works. It makes injustice feel like justice. It makes theft feel like opportunity. It makes displacement feel like destiny. When Laura sat down to write her books in the 1930s, she had a choice. She could write about her family's role in Indigenous displacement critically. She could acknowledge the Osage perspective. She could admit that her family had occupied land they had no right to claim. Or she could write it the way she remembered it, as adventure, as hardship overcome, as pioneers taming a wild frontier. She chose nostalgia, just like she chose to include the Minstrel show without critique, just like she chose to write. There were no people, only Indians lived there. These weren't accidents, they were choices, and those choices reflected the racism of the 1860s when the events happened, and the racism of the 1930s when she was writing. Because here's something crucial. Laura could have learned better. By the 1930s, there were white Americans who recognized the injustice done to Indigenous people. There were historians documenting broken treaties. There were activists fighting for Indigenous rights. Laura chose not to engage with any of that. She chose to preserve the myth of the empty frontier, the myth of pioneers bringing civilization to wilderness, the myth of white settlers as heroes and Indigenous people as obstacles. And for decades, millions of children absorbed that myth through her books. They learned that westward expansion was brave and good, that pioneers deserved the land, that Indigenous people were threats to white families, not families defending their own homes. They learned a version of history that erased Indigenous humanity. That's why, in 2018, when the Association for Library Service to Children voted to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from their award, they didn't just cite the Minstrel show, they cited the anti-native and anti-black sentiments throughout her work. Because you can't separate the two, the entertainment racism and the structural racism, the mocking and the theft, the blackface performance and the illegal squatting. They're part of the same system, the same ideology, the same white supremacy that told Charles Ingalls he had the right to take Osage land and mock black people for entertainment. And his daughter spent 60 years turning that white supremacy into children's literature. And now here's where it gets complicated. Laura Ingalls Wilder wasn't lying about everything. The hardships she described were real. The poverty, the hunger, the constant moving, the brutal winters, all of it happened. Her family struggled. They worked hard. They faced losses. The Little House books contain genuine historical value. They document frontier life with vivid detail. They show what it was like to survive without modern conveniences. And for generations of readers, especially girls, the books provided something rare. A female protagonist who was strong, observant, resilient. Laura wasn't a passive princess. She worked. She learned. She survived. Those elements matter. They're why people love the books. But good parts don't erase harmful parts. The books can be historically valuable and perpetuate racist stereotypes. They can feature a strong female protagonist and erase Indigenous humanity. They can document frontier hardships and romanticize settler colonialism. All of that is true at once. The Little House books are complicated. Charles Ingalls was complicated. Laura Ingalls Wilder was complicated. They contain truth and lies, beauty and ugliness, value and harm. So what do we do with that complexity? Do we keep teaching these books? If so, how? Do we add context, pair them with Indigenous authors, teach them only to older students who can handle critical analysis? Do we keep them in libraries with warning labels? Do we trust parents to guide their children through the racism, or acknowledge that many parents learned the same myths? Do we let institutions honour Laura Ingalls Wilder, or say that honour implies endorsement? These questions don't have easy answers. But here's what we can't do. We can't pretend the racism isn't there. We can't read, "There were no people, only Indians lived there," and shrug it off. We can't describe Charles Ingalls' illegal occupation of Osage land and call it innocent pioneering. We can't separate the man who loved his daughters from the man who participated in systemic oppression, because they're the same man. The 2018 decision to rename the award was about facing that reality, about saying, these books matter, and the racism in them matters too. But that decision didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of decades of work by people who refused to let the harm be ignored. Because while millions of children were reading the Little House books and learning the myth of the empty frontier, there were others sounding the alarm. Black librarians who read the minstrel scene and saw the dehumanization, Indigenous educators who read the No People line and saw the erasure, scholars of colour who pointed out the harm, wrote the articles, raised the concerns, and for decades they were ignored. Buried in the ground where Charles Ingalls built his Kansas house, there were Osage artefacts, remnants of villages, evidence of the people who'd lived there before. Laura called them Indian beads in her book, pretty trinkets that 3-year-old Laura could play with. She didn't call them what they were: proof of displacement, evidence of theft, remnants of families forced from their homes. That's the story Laura chose to tell, the story of pioneers and progress, the story where white settlers are heroes. But there's another story underneath. The story of the Osage families who came home to find strangers living in houses built from their trees. The story of treaties broken and land stolen. The story of a government that promised protection and then sold the land out from under the people it was supposed to defend. That story didn't make it into the Little House books, but in Chapter 4 we're going to talk about who tried to tell it. We're going to talk about the voices that were silenced, the perspectives that were erased, the critics who spent decades saying, "This is harm, this matters, listen to us." We're going to talk about why it took 77 years for institutions to finally listen, and we're going to talk about what happened when they did. Because the 2018 vote didn't just happen, it was fought for. By people whose names you don't know, whose concerns were dismissed for generations, who kept speaking anyway. This is their story, and it's long overdue. This is their story. But first you need to understand something about silence, not the absence of speaking, the refusal to listen. Because from the moment Little Town on the Prairie was published in 1941, there were people who saw the harm. From the moment children opened Little House on the Prairie in 1935 and read, "There were no people, only Indians lived there," there were readers who understood exactly what that line meant. They spoke, they wrote letters, they raised concerns, and for decades they were ignored. You're sitting in a library in the 1950s. The shelves are lined with the distinctive orange and white spines of the Little House books, worn from eager hands. Teachers recommend them as the gold standard of American historical fiction. Parents buy them for birthdays. The books are wholesome, educational, a window into a brave past. And you're a black librarian, reading Chapter 21 of Little Town on the Prairie. You're reading about Charles Ingalls in Blackface, performing a minstrel show, and Laura watching with delight. Something twists in your chest. You know what minstrelsy was. You know its history as a tool of oppression. You know the damage those images caused, the dehumanization they perpetuated, the violence they justified. And this is a children's book. You write a letter to the publisher, careful, professional. You point out that the scene presents racist entertainment without critique. You argue that young black readers will see themselves mocked in the pages of a classic, and white readers will absorb the message that this dehumanization was normal, acceptable, fun. The letter is acknowledged, politely, with a form letter assuring you that the author intended no harm, nothing changes. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. During this same era, Charlemagne Hill Rollins, head of children's services at the Chicago Public Library, was fighting a battle on multiple fronts. In 1941, the same year Little Town on the Prairie was published, Rollins released a seminal bibliography titled We Build Together. It was a guide to books for black children that portrayed them with dignity and humanity, explicitly warning against the pickaninny and mammy stereotypes plaguing mainstream publishing. Rollins and her colleagues were sounding the alarm, creating the resources educators needed to do better. But when it came to the Little House books, their expertise was dismissed. The concerns were filed away as oversensitivity. Because this was the 1950s, segregation was still legal, the civil rights movement was just beginning to stir, and children's literature? The prevailing white attitude was that it was supposed to be innocent, pure, a safe space where we didn't have to think about ugly things like systemic oppression, except it was never innocent, and the people pointing that out were silenced. Move forward to 1952. A reader writes to Harper and Brothers, Wilder's publisher, while pointing out the line, there were no people, only Indians lived there. The editor who receives the letter is shocked. In internal correspondence later archived, the editor admits, "It is unbelievable that not a single person caught this." The line is eventually revised to read, "There were no settlers, only Indians lived there." But think about that timeline. The book was published in 1935. It took 17 years before anyone at the publishing house noticed, or cared, enough to correct a sentence that implied Indigenous people weren't human. 17 years. How many children read that line in those 17 years? How many absorbed the message? How many Indigenous children felt the sting of that erasure in their classrooms, and the revision didn't fix the deeper problem? The book still framed Indigenous people as obstacles to white settlement, still portrayed them as threats rather than families defending their homes, still told the story exclusively from the colonizer's perspective. When Indigenous educators and librarians pointed this out in the following decades, they were told they were being too political, that it was just historical fiction, that children wouldn't notice. But children did notice, especially the children being dehumanized. You're 10 years old in the 1970s, you're Native American, your teacher assigns Little House on the Prairie. You open the book and start reading about your ancestors. Except they're not really your ancestors in these pages. They're described as wild and screaming. Ma is terrified of them even though they've done nothing threatening. Pa says, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," and while Laura narratively questions this, the text never fully rejects it. You're 10 years old, reading this in school. Your white classmates are reading it too. And when they look at you afterward, something has shifted. Something subtle, but you feel it. You feel the weight of the stereotypes settling over you. This is the harm the critics were talking about. But in the 1970s, when you or your parents try to say something, you're told that these are classics, that Laura Ingalls Wilder is an important American author, that we can't censor history, as if centering white narratives and erasing Indigenous humanity is history. Yeah, as if teaching children that racism is normal is education. The 1980s and 1990s bring some shifts. Feminist scholars begin analysing the gender dynamics in the Little House books, celebrating Laura's independence. Some start noting the racist elements too. Multiculturalism enters educational discourse. There's more attention to representation in children's literature. But it remains mostly academic, confined to scholarly journals that classroom teachers don't read and busy librarians don't have time for. The books stay in the curriculum. The award keeps Wilder's name. The voices of black and Indigenous critics remain on the margins. Then came the digital age. The 2000s brought the internet, blogs, online discussions. Suddenly, it was easier for marginalised voices to speak directly to larger audiences without going through traditional white gatekeepers. Librarians of colour started writing essays about problematic classics. Parents shared blog posts about their children's experiences. Indigenous educators created resources for teaching about accurate representations versus harmful stereotypes. The concerns weren't new, but now they were harder to ignore. Then, in November 2014, everything changed. Pioneer Girl. The annotated autobiography was published. You need to understand what this book was and why it mattered. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's original autobiography, written in 1929 and 1930, had been rejected by publishers. Too dark, too adult, too raw for the children's market. Her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, a prolific writer in her own right, took that manuscript and transformed it into the cosy, episodic children's fiction we know today. But the original manuscript survived, hidden in archives, inaccessible for decades, until Pamela Smith Hill, a Wilder biographer, spent years annotating it for publication. The result was massive, 444 pages, over 1,200 annotations, 125 images, 8 maps, hundreds of footnotes based on primary sources like land records and census data. For the first time, readers could see exactly what Wilder originally wrote before Rose transformed it. The historical context, what Wilder left out, what she changed, what she chose to emphasize, and it made the racism undeniable. The minstrel show scene was there, annotated with the brutal history of blackface minstrelsy. The Kansas squatting was there, annotated with the specific text of the broken Osage treaties. The racism was documented, explained, impossible to dismiss. Pioneer Girl became a surprise New York Times bestseller, reaching number 2 in 2015. Thousands of people read it. Journalists wrote extensive think pieces. Book clubs debated it. For many readers, it was the first time they confronted the full scope of the issues. Pamela Smith Hill said in interviews, "It's very disturbing, but it is part of our history, and if we don't talk about these issues honestly with our children, we are jeopardizing their future." That was 2014, 4 years before the award name change. Those 4 years matter. Because Pioneer Girl created a scholarly context that made institutional action possible. It gave educators and librarians the tools to discuss the books critically. It provided hard evidence that the concerns raised by marginalized voices for decades were legitimate. It also arrived at a moment when America was finally, painfully, incompletely, beginning to reckon with racism in new ways. August 2014. Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, Missouri. The protests force a national conversation about systemic racism that white America had long avoided. The hashtag Own Voices movement gains momentum in the literary world, emphasizing that stories about marginalized communities should be told by people from those communities. Institutions start examining their own complicity in perpetuating racism. And in this context, the questions about the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award became impossible to ignore. Members of the Association for Library Service to Children, particularly members of colour, began raising concerns directly. They argued that an award bearing Wilder's name sends a message. It implies endorsement not just of her literary craft, but of the values embedded in her work. A teacher, surveyed later by the ALSC task force, put it this way: "An award is a powerful signal. It signals that the books awarded are to be held as a pinnacle of not just quality, but of values and messages for its readers. To have an award named after a book that is degrading to many signals that those voices don't matter and are outweighed by the power of tradition." Read that last line again. Those voices don't matter and are outweighed by the power of tradition. That's what had been happening for 77 years. And Black and Indigenous librarians, educators, parents and children saying, "Oh, this hurts, this matters, listen." And the institution saying, "Tradition matters more." In early 2018, ALSC President Nina Lindsay announced the formation of an awards program review task force. Their charge was clear: examine the Wilder Award and make a recommendation about whether changes should be made to align the award with the organization's core values: integrity, respect, inclusiveness, and responsiveness. The task force moved quickly. They distributed surveys to members, non-members, and stakeholders: writers, publishers, librarians, educators. They collected feedback. They read scholarly materials about Wilder's books and the award's history. On May 15, 2018, the task force submitted their recommendation: rename the award, Change it from the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award to the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The recommendation acknowledged Wilder's literary contributions. It didn't call for banning the books. It didn't erase her from history. It simply said, "We can't put our institutional name behind hers anymore, not while her work reflects dated cultural attitudes toward Indigenous people and people of colour that contradict modern acceptance, celebration, and understanding of diverse communities." The ALSC board scheduled a vote for June 23, 2018, during the American Library Association's annual conference in New Orleans. You're in that room now. It's a Saturday afternoon. The board members are seated around a large table. The weight of what they're about to do is palpable. Because this isn't just about one author or one award. This is about whether institutions can change, whether they can listen to voices they've ignored for decades, whether they can choose values over tradition. The vote is called. It's unanimous, 12-0. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Award is now the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The name change takes effect immediately. There's a scramble of logistics, signage to be changed, new certificates to be printed, the programme for the awards banquet the very next day to be updated. On June 24, 2018, Jacqueline Woodson receives the first Children's Literature Legacy Award. Woodson is a black author. Her books, like Brown Girl Dreaming and Each Kindness, centre black characters and black experiences with nuance and love. She's receiving an award that just one day earlier has bore the name of a white author whose books diminished and erased people who looked like her. The symbolism is profound. Nina Lindsay and ALA President Jim Neal release a joint statement. "We made this decision in order to bring our awards program into consistency with our mission. ALSC's core values include integrity, respect, inclusiveness, and responsiveness, and we found we needed to review the names of awards with those values in mind." The backlash is immediate and fierce. Wilder's defenders flood social media, op-ed pages, comment sections. They say the decision is political correctness gone mad. They accuse ALSC of erasing history. They argue Wilder is being judged unfairly by modern standards. Some, on the other side, claim the book should be banned entirely. Others say the name change doesn't go far enough. The debate explodes across the country. But here's what gets lost in that noise. The black librarian in the 1950s whose letter was politely acknowledged and then ignored. The Indigenous educator in the 1970s who tried to explain why there were no people was erasure. The parent of colour in the 1990s who asked why these books were still taught without critical context. The scholars who wrote articles that were dismissed as academic overreach. And the children who read these books and felt diminished. For them, June 23, 2018, wasn't a sudden decision. It was 77 years overdue, and the name change wasn't erasure, it was finally listening. Wilder's books are still in print, still in libraries and bookstores. She's still honoured as the first recipient of the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Her literary contributions are still acknowledged. What changed is this. An institution said that honouring someone means honouring the impact of their work, including the harm. And if we can't separate the harm from the achievement, then we have to choose what we're willing to put our name behind. ALSC chose not to put their name behind racism. Even racism embedded in beloved classics. Even racism from a product of her time. Even racism that makes people uncomfortable to acknowledge. They chose the voices that had been ignored, and that choice, that unanimous vote, that's the story that matters. Because this isn't really about Laura Ingalls Wilder, it's about who we listen to, who we believe when they say, "This hurts." Whether we're willing to change when our traditions cause harm. It's about whether institutions built by white people, for white people, can learn to serve everyone. June 23, 2018 says, maybe, finally, after 77 years, maybe we can learn. But the story doesn't end there, because in Chapter 5 we're going to talk about what happens next, after you rename an award, after you acknowledge the harm, after you say, "We got this wrong for decades." We're going to talk about the teachers who still assign these books, the parents who still buy them, the children who still love them. We're going to talk about critical literacy. How do we teach these books honestly? How do we hold both the value and the harm? How do we learn from the past without romanticizing it? And we're going to talk about the bigger question underneath all of this. How do we reckon with beloved American mythology when that mythology was built on racism? Because Charles Ingalls in Blackface and Charles Ingalls squatting on Osage land, those aren't aberrations. They are the American story, the one we've been telling ourselves for generations, the one we've been teaching children through books like Laura's. And if we're finally ready to question Laura Ingalls Wilder, maybe we're finally ready to question the stories we tell about America itself. That's what comes next, and it's going to be uncomfortable. The award name changed. The institution listened. The voices that had been silenced for 77 years finally broke through. But the books are still on the shelves. You're standing in a classroom in 2019, 1 year after the name change. You're a 4th grade teacher, holding a worn copy of Little House on the Prairie. You've taught this book for 12 years. You loved it as a child. You remember curling up under a quilt reading about Laura and Mary, feeling transported to another time. And now you're staring at the page where it says there were no people, only Indians lived there. And you don't know what to do. Do you skip the chapter, read it aloud and hope no one notices? Stop mid-sentence and explain why this is wrong. Your hands are shaking. Because you have Indigenous students in your class. You have black students. Students whose ancestors were the people Charles Ingalls displaced, the people Laura Ingalls Wilder diminished, and you have white students who will absorb these messages if you don't intervene. You have a choice to make. This is where we are now, in the classroom, in the library, in the living room where a grandmother wants to share her favourite childhood books with her granddaughter and suddenly realises she needs context first. The 2018 decision didn't ban the books. It didn't remove them from libraries. It didn't tell parents they can't read them to their children. What it did was force the question. If we're going to engage with these books, how do we do it responsibly? The answer is something called critical literacy. Critical literacy isn't about censorship. It's about teaching students, even young ones, to ask questions about what they read. Who wrote this? From whose perspective? Who's missing from this story? Whose experiences are centred and whose are erased? It's about reading with students instead of just reading to them. Let's go back to that classroom. You're the teacher holding Little House on the Prairie. You've made a decision. You're going to teach the book, but you're going to teach it differently. Before you even open to page 1, you gather your students. You show them a map of the United States in 1869. You point to Kansas. You explain that this land had been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. You show them treaties, actual documents where the US government promised the Osage Nation that Kansas land would be theirs. Then you explain what happened when white settlers like the Ingalls family ignored those treaties. You use the word illegal, because that's what it was. You're already reframing the story, thus giving your students context before Laura Ingalls Wilder's narrative can shape how they see it. And then you do something crucial. You pull out another book, The Birchbark House by Louise Erdrich. Published in 1999, it's explicit in its purpose, to tell the story of the same historical period from an Ojibwe girl's perspective. Omakayas is 7 years old, living with her family on an island in Lake Superior in 1847. Her world is rich with tradition, language, seasonal rhythms, family bonds, and it's being destroyed by white settlers moving west. People like the Ingalls family. Erdrich, who is Ojibwe herself, wrote the series deliberately to counter the Little House narrative. In interviews, she said she wanted to show what Laura Ingalls Wilder left out: the humanity of Indigenous people, the violence of displacement, the perspective of those who were there first. So you teach both books, side by side. You ask your students, what does Laura see? What does Omakayas see? Whose home is this land? Who's moving where and why? You're not saying Little House is bad and Birchbark is good. You're teaching them that every story has a perspective, and the perspective we've centred for generations isn't the only one, or even the most important one. This is critical literacy in action, and it's hard work. Some parents will complain. They'll say you're making literature political. They'll accuse you of ruining their childhood memories, They'll demand to know why you can't just let kids enjoy a good story. And you'll have to explain over and over that these books were always political. That centering white settlers as heroes and indigenous people as obstacles is a political choice. That erasing black humanity through minstrel show scenes is a political act. You're not making it political. You're revealing the politics that were always there. But some parents will thank you. Indigenous parents who grew up reading these books and feeling erased will thank you for giving their children a different experience. Black parents who had to explain minstrelsy to their 8-year-olds will thank you for not putting that burden on their children alone. And your students, they're capable of more complexity than we give them credit for. Research on critical literacy shows that even young children, kindergartners, can understand that stories come from specific perspectives, that books can be beautiful and harmful at the same time. Children aren't fragile. They're perceptive. What damages them isn't learning that beloved books contain racism. What damages them is absorbing racist messages uncritically year after year until those messages shape how they see themselves and others. So you teach the books with context. You pair them with Indigenous and Black authors. You ask hard questions. You create space for students to grapple with the fact that Laura Ingalls Wilder was a talented writer who also perpetuated harm. Because that's the work now. Not banning, not erasing, not pretending the books don't exist, but refusing to teach them as neutral history, refusing to centre only white perspectives, refusing to let nostalgia silence the voices of those who are harmed, and slowly, painfully slowly, it's working. Debbie Rees, a Nambe Pueblo scholar and educator, has spent decades documenting representations of Native people in children's literature through her website American Indians in Children's Literature. For years, her work was dismissed by mainstream publishers. She was told she was too sensitive, too political, too demanding. But after 2018, something shifted. Publishers started listening. Awards specifically for Indigenous authors were created. Schools began seeking out books by Native writers, instead of books about Native people written by white authors. Rees's message has always been clear. I believe the books Native students read in school play a significant role in how Native students fare. It matters who tells the stories. It matters whose perspective is centred. It matters whether Indigenous children see themselves reflected with dignity and humanity, or reduced to obstacles in someone else's pioneer fantasy. And now, finally, institutions are beginning to act like it matters. John, but let's be honest, this isn't a clean victory. The Little House books are still bestsellers. The TV show still airs in syndication, sanitizing the racism and making the mythology more palatable. Tourist sites into Smet and Walnut Grove draw thousands of visitors who want to experience pioneer life. And many of those visitors are white women. Women who grew up reading these books, who dreamed of living in a little house on the prairie, who felt connected to Laura in ways that shaped their childhoods. The connection is real, the love is real, and the harm is also real. So what do you do when something you love is flawed? You don't have to stop loving it. But you do have to see it clearly. You can appreciate Laura Ingalls Wilder's prose, her ability to make a winter blizzard come alive on the page, her eye for detail, her documentation of daily life. Those are real literary achievements. And you can also say, the minstrel show scene is racist. The no people line is racist. The entire framing of westward expansion as heroic pioneering rather than violent colonization is racist. You can hold both truths. What you can't do is pretend the harm doesn't exist. You can't say it was a different time and use that as permission to avoid reckoning with what the books taught and continue to teach millions of readers. Here's the question underneath all of this. What do we owe the next generation? Comfort. The same uncomplicated stories we grew up with. The same myths about American greatness and pioneer courage. Or truth. Even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it means confronting the fact that our beloved childhood books perpetuated racism. The teachers choosing critical literacy are saying, we owe them truth. The institutions renaming awards are saying, we owe them truth. The Indigenous authors writing counter-narratives are saying, we owe them truth. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, mainstream American culture is starting to listen. But there's resistance. Because truth is hard. Truth requires us to give up the comforting myths, to see Charles Ingalls as both a loving father and an illegal squatter, to see Laura Ingalls Wilder as both a talented writer and someone who perpetuated racist ideologies. Truth requires complexity. We want heroes and villains, good books and bad books, simple categories where everything fits neatly. But history doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. Charles Ingalls could love his daughters fiercely and also participate in systemic oppression. Laura Ingalls. Wilder could write beautiful prose and also erase indigenous humanity. America could be a place where people worked hard and built communities, and also a place built on stolen land and enslaved labour. When we teach the next generation, we have to teach the full picture, not to make them cynical, not to destroy their sense of wonder, but to make them thoughtful, to teach them that loving something doesn't mean defending all of it. That history is complicated and messy and full of people who are neither purely good nor purely evil. That's the work, and it's happening. In classrooms where teachers pair Little House with Birchbark House, in libraries where displays highlight Indigenous authors, in book clubs where adults are finally reading the critical analyses they never encountered as children, in families where parents say, "I loved these books when I was your age, and I'm learning now that they caused harm. Let's read them together and talk about what's valuable and what's problematic." That's not erasure. That's honesty. That's the difference between nostalgia and history. Nostalgia says, everything was better back then. The past was simpler, purer, more wholesome. History says, the past was complicated. People made choices that had consequences. Some of those consequences were harm. We have to reckon with that. The 2018 vote was a choice for history over nostalgia. Every teacher who chooses critical literacy is making that choice again. Every parent who has hard conversations instead of avoiding them is making that choice. Every reader who picks up Birchbark House alongside Little House is making that choice. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. But it's necessary. Because the alternative is continuing to teach generations of children that white perspectives are universal. That Indigenous people were obstacles to be removed. That black people were entertainment. That theft is pioneering if you call it by a pretty name. And we can't do that anymore, so here's where we are. 6 years after the award name change, the conversation continues. The books are still read, still taught, still loved, but increasingly they're read with context, taught alongside counter-narratives, loved with acknowledgement of the harm. That's progress. Not perfect, not finished, but progress. And maybe that's the lesson. We don't have to reject everything from the past. We don't have to pretend people who participated in systemic racism were monsters, but we have a responsibility to see clearly, to listen to the voices that were silenced, to make space for perspectives that were erased, to teach the next generation that loving something means being honest about its flaws. That's what we owe them. Truth, complexity, the tools to think critically about the stories they're told. And maybe, just maybe, a future where the default narrative isn't always the white settler's perspective, where Indigenous children grow up reading books where they're the protagonists, not the obstacles, where black children don't have to encounter minstrel show scenes in their school reading, where all children learn that history is complicated, that good people can do harmful things, that beloved books can contain racism, that we can hold the beauty and the harm and choose to move forward with clearer eyes. You're standing in that classroom again. You're holding Little House on the Prairie in one hand and the Birchbark House in the other. Your students are waiting. You take a breath. Today we're going to read two stories about the same time in American history, but they're told from very different perspectives, and I want you to think about why that matters. This is the work. This is what comes after the award is renamed, after the institution listens, after 77 years of silence. This is how we move forward. Not by erasing the past, but by refusing to let the past erase anyone else. Not by banning books, but by teaching them honestly. Not by rejecting complexity, but by embracing it. But here's what no one told you when you started this journey. The work doesn't end. Because in 2024, 6 years after the name change, a school board in Texas voted to remove Little House on the Prairie from their 3rd grade curriculum. Not because of critical literacy, but because parents complained it was too controversial. The book wasn't paired with Indigenous perspectives. It wasn't taught with context. It was simply removed. And in another district in Minnesota, a teacher was reprimanded for teaching the birchbark house because parents said it was anti-American. In Florida, legislation is being debated that would restrict how teachers can discuss race and history. Some lawmakers are calling books like Birchbark House divisive concepts. This is the backlash. Because when you challenge the myth, when you center voices that have been marginalized, when you teach history honestly, there will always be people who want the comfortable lie instead. People who want their children to read about Pa and his fiddle and never think about the Osage families he displaced. People who want the little house on the prairie but not the bodies buried in the ground. And those people have power. They sit on school boards, they write legislation, they organize campaigns to remove books from libraries. The 2018 vote was a victory. But it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a fight that's still happening right now. In classrooms where teachers are deciding whether critical literacy is worth the risk of losing their jobs. In libraries where librarians are fighting to keep diverse books on the shelves. In communities where parents are showing up to school board meetings to defend their children's right to read honestly about history. This is the story we're living. And it's far from over. This is the story we're living in. You're sitting in a school board meeting in Hernando County, just Florida, on a Tuesday morning in May 2024. It's 8:30 a.m., deliberately scheduled early to avoid pushing the discussion late into the night. The room is packed. Parents, teachers, librarians, activists wearing red t-shirts that say, "Stop." And on the other side, members of Moms for Liberty, holding manila folders filled with book challenge forms. 23 books are under review today. Picture books, young adult novels, books with LGBTQ characters, books by authors of colour, books about racism, books about sexuality, books about history told from perspectives other than white settlers. Review committees, made up of teachers, parents and community members, have already read all 23 books. They've recommended keeping 13 of them in school libraries, but the school board has the final say. And when the vote comes, 19 of the 20 books are removed. You watch it happen. You watch board members override the recommendations of educators who actually read the books. You watch them strip shelves based not on content review, but on political pressure. This isn't 1883, this isn't even 2018. This is happening right now. Welcome to the backlash. The numbers. In 2023, the American Library Association documented attempts to censor 4,240 unique book titles, a 65% increase from the previous year. It was the highest number of challenged books ever recorded in the organization's history. In 2024, the numbers started to decline slightly. 821 attempts targeting 2,452 titles, but that's misleading, because those numbers only track challenges, formal requests to review books. They don't track the bans, books actually removed from shelves. PEN America, which specifically monitors school book bans, released preliminary data in September 2024 that told a different story. Over 10,000 books were banned in public schools during the 2023 to 2024 school year. 10,000 books. That's nearly triple the 3,362 bans recorded the previous year. And 8,000 of those bans. They happened in just 2 states, Florida and Iowa. This isn't scattered, organic concern from individual parents. This is coordinated, organized, funded. The Machine Moms for Liberty, founded in 2021 by 3 Florida parents upset about COVID-19 mask mandates, now has 285 chapters and over 115,000 members across 45 states. What started as protest against pandemic policies morphed into a full-scale campaign against books. But they're not alone. They're part of a network. Citizens Defending Freedom, founded in 2021, operates in 14 states with 67 chapters. They provide template legislation for state lawmakers. They train candidates to run for school boards. They offer how to challenge a book workshops. No Left Turn in Education, started in 2020, focuses specifically on curriculum. They maintain a database of inappropriate materials and encourage members to file challenges. These organisations share funding sources. They coordinate messaging. They appear at the same events, often with the same speakers. The Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank with an annual budget of over $80 million, provides policy frameworks. The Goldwater Institute offers legal support. Smaller state-level groups handle ground operations. It's not grassroots. It's astroturf, designed to look like organic parent concern while operating as a well-funded political movement. The playbook is consistent across the country. Step 1. Target books featuring LGBTQ characters, books by authors of colour, books about racism or sexuality, or any history that challenges white-centred narratives. Step 2. Use charged language. Call them pornographic. Call them divisive. Call them grooming. Step 3. Flood school boards with challenges. Even if most fail, the volume overwhelms librarians and creates the appearance of widespread concern. Step 4. Run for school board seats. Even in small districts where elections get little attention, a few organised candidates can win. Step 5. Once in power, override expert recommendations and ban books based on political ideology rather than educational value, and it's working. What's actually in these books? Let's talk about what they're banning. Genderqueer by Maya Kobebe topped the most challenged list for 3 consecutive years. It's a memoir about gender identity. Critics call it pornographic because it contains illustrations of the author's journey, including medical consultations about transition. Schools are banning it. But here's what they're not saying. It's been a lifeline for gender non-conforming teens who finally saw themselves represented. For students questioning their identity, Genderqueer was often the first book that said, "You're not alone." The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature, is frequently challenged for its depiction of sexual violence and racism. The novel follows an 11-year-old black girl who prays for blue eyes because she's internalized white beauty standards. It's devastating. It's necessary. And it's being removed from shelves because it makes white students uncomfortable. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, a memoir about growing up black and queer in New Jersey, faces challenges for sexually explicit content. The book addresses sexual assault and explores black masculinity. It's been removed from dozens of school libraries. The Hate You, Give by Angie Thomas, tells the story of a black teenager who witnesses a police officer shoot her unarmed friend. It became essential reading after George Floyd's murder. Now it's being banned for anti-police bias. Notice the pattern? Books that make marginalised students feel seen are being removed for making privileged students uncomfortable. Books that tell truth about racism, about sexuality, about power and violence and identity, those are the ones being banned. Meanwhile, Little House on the Prairie, with its "there were no people, only Indians lived there" line and romanticisation of illegal land theft, remains on elementary school reading lists in many of the same districts, because apparently discomfort only matters when white students feel it. The human cost. You're a school librarian in 2023. You've worked at this school for 15 years. You know every student by name. You help them find books that make them feel seen, books that challenge them, books that open windows into worlds they've never imagined. And then one day, a parent files a challenge to a book with an LGBTQ character. The book goes through the review process. The committee recommends keeping it. The board votes to retain it. You think it's over. But then the parent starts posting about you on social media, calling you a groomer, saying you're promoting an agenda, claiming you're corrupting children. Other parents pile on. The comments get more vicious. Someone posts your home address. One day a parent accosts you on the street. You report it to your administration. You say you feel unsafe. They tell you there's nothing they can do. This isn't hypothetical. This is a real school librarian's testimony, documented in a 2023 survey by School Library Journal. And it's not isolated. Edith, public youth librarian, reported threats of sexual assault, stalking, misogynistic comments, threats of violence, public masturbation and verbal abuse. When she asked for support, she was encouraged to use FMLA for therapy, but not to take time off. Michael Threets, a librarian in California, resigned at age 34 after facing repeated death threats. One visitor repeatedly threatened his life. Patrons brandished knives at each other in the library. His lifelong anxiety and depression intensified to the point where he couldn't continue. "It was a privilege to serve the library that shaped my upbringing," he wrote when he announced his resignation. But read between those lines, read what he's not saying. This is what happens when you try to defend books in 2024. This is what happens when you say, children deserve to see themselves in literature. You get harassed, you get threatened, you lose your job or your mental health or both, and the institutions that are supposed to protect you, they tell you to go to therapy. The statistics are staggering. A 2023 survey found that 71% of school librarians reported increased stress and anxiety related to book challenges. 67% said they were self-censoring, choosing not to order books they knew would be challenged, even if those books had educational value. And 28% of librarians surveyed said they were considering leaving the profession entirely. Think about what that means. Nearly 1 in 3 librarians, the people who dedicated their careers to connecting children with books, are ready to quit because the environment has become too hostile. We're not just losing books. We're losing the people who know how to help children find them. The legal battleground. Meanwhile, state legislatures are passing laws that make everything worse. In 2022, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed the Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employees Act, commonly called the Stop WOKE Act. The law bans teaching that anyone must feel guilt, anguish, or other forms of psychological distress based on their race as a result of actions by others in the past. Read that again. It bans teaching about racism if it might make white students uncomfortable. Florida also rejected the College Board's AP African American Studies course, citing subjects like Black queer studies, the reparations movement, and intersectionality. The state said intersectionality, the way different forms of inequality overlap, is a foundation of critical race theory. Except critical race theory was never taught in Florida's K-12 schools. 9 Florida school districts confirmed this explicitly. Several replied with one word: no. Our traditional public schools have not taught, were not teaching, and do not teach critical race theory, said Sarasota County Schools spokesperson Kelsey Wheely. It doesn't matter. The law passed anyway. Iowa passed SF 496 in 2023, banning books depicting sex acts from school libraries. Sounds reasonable until you realize sex acts is so broadly defined that it includes books about sexual assault, reproductive health, and LGBTQ relationships. The law led to the immediate removal of thousands of books. Librarians, terrified of legal liability, began pulling anything that might possibly be challenged. Poetry by Amanda Gorman, The Handmaid's Tale, even some versions of the Bible. Texas, Tennessee, Missouri, they're all passing similar legislation, and the laws are written vaguely enough that schools err on the side of removing books rather than risking lawsuits. But here's the thing about vague laws. They can be challenged. In Escambia County, Florida, several students in PEN America filed a federal lawsuit challenging the county's book ban policy. They argued it violates the First Amendment. The case is ongoing, but it represents a shift. For years, book banning happened quietly. Librarians removed books. Students didn't know what they were missing. Now students are suing. Katie Wood, a Escambia County student, ESOS testified, "When I go to the library, I want to be able to find books that represent my experiences. I want my friends to find books that represent theirs. These bans are silencing voices." In November 2023, a federal judge issued a preliminary injunction blocking parts of Iowa's book ban law, ruling it likely violated the First Amendment. The state appealed, and the case continues through the courts. But the legal challenges are having an effect. They're forcing school boards to justify their decisions. They're creating a record of who voted to ban which books and why. And they're showing students that they don't have to accept censorship, that they have rights. that they can fight back. The resistance you're in Brevard County, Florida in early 2024. The school board is considering bans on Slaughterhouse-5 and the Kite Runner. The room is packed, and this time, it's not Moms for Liberty dominating the conversation. Speaker after speaker, parents, students, teachers, stands up to defend the books. One parent praises the Kite Runner as gut-wrenching, thought-provoking, noting its historical context about the Taliban's rise. A high school student named Ava Wolfenkohler says she's sad that students have to plead with board members not to ban books. She says she's eager to vote against board members who seek to remove literature. People are wearing red t-shirts that say "Stop," supporting Stop Mums for Liberty, a counter-organisation formed to push back against censorship. The board votes. At the end of the meeting, no one has voiced support for banning the books. Students and teachers are organising a rally against academic censorship. They're planning to distribute banned books. They're registering new voters, and this is happening across the country. In Forsyth County, Georgia, a group of students formed the Banned Book Club. They meet in a local independent bookstore, reading and discussing the exact books their school board tried to remove. They're creating videos explaining why these books matter. They're testifying at board meetings. In Llano County, Texas, a federal judge ordered the county to return books to library shelves after residents sued. The judge ruled that removing books because officials disagreed with the ideas they contained violated the First Amendment. 7 books were returned, including Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, and they called themselves the KKK. Yes, by Susan Campbell Bartoletti. Publishers are fighting back too. Penguin Random House joined a lawsuit in Virginia Beach challenging book removals. Major publishing houses are providing legal support to librarians facing challenges, and authors are speaking out. Jodi Picoult, whose books have been frequently challenged, said, "Book banning is a canary in the coal mine. It's a warning sign of authoritarianism." Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale, created a fireproof edition of her book and auctioned it to raise money for PEN America. The point was clear. You can try to burn books, but the ideas won't die. George M. Johnson, author of All Boys Aren't Blue, travels the country speaking to students in districts where their book has been banned. They tell students, "Your stories matter. Your existence is not pornographic. Yeah, don't let anyone silence you." Local bookstores are creating banned book displays, featuring the exact titles removed from schools. Sales of banned books have skyrocketed, not in schools, but in communities where readers are deliberately seeking out the stories someone tried to hide. The Brooklyn Public Library launched a Books Unbanned program, offering free digital library cards to anyone aged 13 to 21 in the United States. Teens can access banned books remotely, even if their school removed them. By 2024, over 7,000 teens across the country had signed up. This is resistance. Not just organizations or lawsuits, but teenagers finding ways around censorship. Parents showing up to meetings. Teachers quietly passing banned books to students who need them. Librarians refusing to be intimidated despite the harassment. The stakes. Because here's what's actually at stake. You're a 14-year-old in rural Iowa. You're questioning your gender identity. You're terrified. You don't know anyone like you. Your parents are conservative. Your church is conservative. Your entire community tells you, implicitly and explicitly, that people like you don't exist or shouldn't. And then you find genderqueer in your school library. You read it in secret, checking it out under a stack of other books so no one sees. And for the first time in your life, you see yourself. You see that other people have felt this way. You see that there are words for what you're experiencing. You see that you're not broken. That book might literally save your life. Now imagine it's gone, removed, banned. Where do you turn? The internet. Where predators and misinformation lurk alongside genuine support. Your parents, who you're terrified to talk to. You turn inward. You suffer alone. The statistics on suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth are already devastating. Take away the books that say you're not alone, and those numbers get worse. Or you're a black student in a predominantly white school. You're reading the curriculum, the standard American history that centers white pioneers, and frames westward expansion as brave exploration rather than violent colonization. You're learning about Charles Ingalls and Laura and the little house on the prairie. You're learning that this land was free for settlers, that Indigenous people were obstacles, that this is the story of America. And then your teacher assigns the birchbark house, or stamped racism, anti-racism, and you, or how to be an anti-racist. And suddenly you see another side. You see the people who were displaced. You see the systems that created inequality. You see yourself not as an outsider to American history, but as central to it. That changes everything. Now imagine those books are banned. Imagine your teacher is too afraid to assign them because a parent might complain, a board member might investigate, they might lose their job. You're left with the single story again. The story that erases you. The story that says white perspectives are universal and yours is divisive. This is what's at stake. Not just books, not just curriculum. But whether students, all students, get to see themselves as fully human in the stories they read. Whether they get to grapple with complicated history or only hear sanitized myths. Whether they learn to think critically about the narratives they're given or accept them uncritically. The people trying to ban books say they're protecting children. From what? From seeing themselves? From learning accurate history? From encountering ideas that challenge them to think? The books they're banning aren't corrupting children. They're teaching them. They're showing them that the world is bigger and more complicated than one perspective, that people who are different from them are still human, that America's history is both inspiring and horrifying, and we have to reckon with both. Taking those books away doesn't protect children, it stunts them. The pattern. And here's the connection back to where we started. In 1883, Charles Ingalls performed in Blackface in Smet. It was normal, acceptable, wholesome family entertainment. In 1941, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about it without critique, published it in a children's book. No one objected. For 77 years that scene sat in Little Town on the Prairie. Children read it, teachers assigned it, librarians recommended it, and when black librarians, Indigenous educators and scholars of colour said, "This is harmful, this is teaching children that racism is normal," they were ignored. For decades, they were ignored. Until 2018, when the weight of those voices finally forced institutions to listen. The pattern is the same. Books that centre white perspectives, that romanticize colonization, that present racism as quaint history, those stay on the shelves. Books that centre marginalised perspectives, that tell honest history, that help non-white children see themselves, those get challenged, banned, removed. The people trying to ban the birchbark house while defending Little House on the Prairie are making the same choice Laura Ingalls Wilder made in 1941. They're choosing the comfortable myth over the uncomfortable truth. They're choosing nostalgia over history. And they're doing it to protect the same thing, a worldview where white settlers are heroes, where American expansion was noble, where racism was unfortunate but understandable, where we don't have to feel bad about the past. But that worldview requires erasure. It requires silencing voices that contradict it. It requires removing books that tell the other side of the story. The 2018 decision to rename the award was about refusing that erasure, or about saying, we're not putting our institutional name behind work that harms, even if that work is beloved, even if it's classic, even if it makes people uncomfortable to acknowledge. The book bans happening now are the backlash to that refusal. They're an attempt to reassert the single story, to reclaim the comfortable myth, and whether they succeed depends on what we do next. What happens now because we're at a crossroads? One path leads to classrooms where teachers are afraid to assign books, where librarians stock only the safest, whitest, most nostalgic titles because anything else risks their jobs, where students grow up reading only stories that centre white perspectives and erase everyone else. That path leads back to 1941, when Little Town on the Prairie was published with a minstrel show scene and no one objected. Back to a time when there were no people, only Indians lived there, could sit in a children's book for 17 years before anyone at the publishing house even noticed. That path is comfortable, familiar, safe, for some people. The other path is harder. It's the path where teachers teach Little House on the Prairie alongside the Birchbark House, where students learn that Charles Ingalls was both a loving father and an illegal squatter, where librarians aren't afraid to stock books by Indigenous authors and LGBTQ writers. That path requires work. It requires showing up to board meetings. It requires defending librarians who are being harassed. It requires voting for school board members who believe in honest education. It requires refusing to let the backlash win. So here's where we are in February 2026. 8 years after the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award was renamed, 6 years into the coordinated book banning movement, the fight continues. In some places it's getting worse. In other places communities are pushing back. The outcome isn't determined yet. And that means it's up to us. Not just librarians, not just teachers, not just parents with kids in school. All of us. Because this isn't really about books. It's about what we're willing to teach the next generation. Are we going to teach them the comfortable myths? Or are we going to teach them the complicated truth? Are we going to let them read only about white settlers who pioneered the frontier? Or are we going to let them read about the Osage families who were displaced, the Dakota people who were erased, the Black Americans who were mocked and dehumanized? Are we going to protect their right to see themselves in books? Or are we going to let organized minorities strip shelves until only the safe stories remain? The 2018 decision to rename the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award was a beginning, not an ending. It said, institutions can change. They can listen to voices they've ignored. They can choose values over tradition. But institutions are made of people, and if people don't defend those choices, they disappear. School boards can vote to retain diverse books, but only if people show up to meetings. Librarians can stock Indigenous authors, but only if communities defend them when they're harassed. Teachers can teach critical literacy, but only if parents support them instead of calling them groomers. This is the work, and it's happening right now. You're standing in a school board meeting, or a library, or a classroom, or your own living room, deciding which books to read with your children. You have a choice to make. You can stay silent. You can assume someone else will fight this battle. You can protect yourself from the harassment and the threats and the exhausting, relentless work of showing up. Or you can speak. You can say, these books matter. These voices matter. This truth matters. You can say, my children deserve to read honestly about history, even when it's uncomfortable. You can say, I will not let nostalgia silence the voices that have already been silenced for too long. The backlash is real. It's organized. It's aggressive, and it's not going away. But neither are we. Because we know now what we didn't know in 1883, what we didn't know in 1941, what we didn't fully understand even in 2018. We know that silence is complicity, that institutions only change when people demand it, that the voices in the margins will keep speaking, but only if we finally listen. We know that Charles Ingalls in Blackface and Charles Ingalls squatting on Osage land weren't aberrations. They were America, and we're still living with the consequences of that America, still fighting about whether to teach it honestly or preserve the myth. The story doesn't end here. It ends in school boards and libraries and classrooms across the country, in the choices we make every single day about what we're willing to fight for. It ends with you, right now. What will you do? What will you do? That's where we left you, standing in a school board meeting or a library or your living room, holding books in your hands, making a choice. But before you answer, before you decide what comes next, there's something else you need to understand. We've spent 6 chapters unravelling Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy. We've traced the line from a schoolhouse in Smet in 1883 to culture war battles in 2026. We've seen Charles Ingalls in Blackface and on stolen Osage land. We've watched institutions finally listen to voices they'd ignored for 77 years. We've documented the backlash, 10,000 books banned, librarians threatened, students fighting for their right to read. We've asked hard questions about nostalgia and truth, about loving flawed things, about what we owe the next generation. But here's the question we haven't asked yet. How much of Laura Ingalls Wilder's actual life do we really know? Think about it. You've read the Little House books. You know Laura as a character, the curious little girl in the sunbonnet, the teenage girl watching her father perform, the pioneer woman documenting frontier life. But that Laura is a construction, a carefully edited version of a real person, shaped by memory and nostalgia and the demands of children's literature. The real Laura Ingalls. Wilder lived for 90 years. She was born in 1867 and died in 1957. The Little House books cover her childhood, roughly from age 4 to 18, from 1871 to 1885. That's 14 years. What about the other 76? She didn't write about her early marriage years in detail. She didn't write about the years when she and Almanzo struggled on their Dakota claim. She didn't write about the baby boy who died in 1889, 12 days old, never named. She didn't write about the diphtheria that left Almanzo partially paralysed. She didn't write about the fire that burned their house to the ground. She didn't write about the debt, the drought, the years of failure that mirrored her father's pattern of chasing dreams that turned to dust. And she especially didn't write about the year and a half she spent living with Almanzo's family in Spring Valley, Minnesota. May 1890 to October 1891, 18 months that are almost completely absent from the public narrative. Why? Because here's what we know about Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was a deliberate storyteller. And she made choices about what to include and what to leave out. She wrote about her father's minstrel show performance and framed it as wholesome fun. She wrote about illegal squatting on Osage land and called it pioneering. She chose what stories to tell, and she chose not to tell the Spring Valley story. That absence is worth examining, because when you look at Laura's life trajectory, the published version, the one in the Little House books, there's a gap. The series ends with her marriage to Almanzo in 1885. The next book, The First 4 Years, wasn't published until after her death, and even that only covers 1885 to 1889. Then nothing. The narrative jumps from 1889 to 1894, when Laura and Almanzo arrive in Mansfield, Missouri, to start their final life at Rocky Ridge Farm. 5 years disappear, and right in the middle of those missing years, Spring Valley. The Spring Valley years. Let's go back to May 1890. Laura is 23 years old. She's been married for nearly 5 years. Her daughter Rose is 3.5. Her infant son is dead. Her husband is recovering from diphtheria that left him struggling to walk. Their house burned down 2 weeks after the baby died. They're living in a 2-room shanty. They're broke. They're sick. They're grieving. And Almanzo's parents, James and Angeline Wilder, visit at Christmas and see the devastation. They make an offer, come to Spring Valley, recuperate at the family farm, rest, recover. In spring 1890, Laura and Almanzo sell the sheep they'd bought with Laura's teaching wages, pack their covered wagon, and head east to Minnesota. So, they arrive in Spring Valley in May 1890. Now, here's what we know about the Wilder family in Spring Valley. Almanzo's father, James Wilder, was a successful farmer. He'd moved the family from New York to Minnesota around 1870, buying over 90 acres of productive farmland. This was the same farm Almanzo had grown up on, the one Laura fictionalized in Farmer Boy. By 1890, James and Angeline were in their 60s. Their children were grown and scattered. Almanzo's older brother Royal was running a business in town. His sister Eliza Jane had taught school in Smet and was now back in Minnesota. And into this family dynamic came Laura, Almanzo, and little Rose. For 18 months. What happened during those 18 months? We don't know. Not really. Laura didn't write about it in her published books. Her autobiography, Pioneer Girl, mentions the Spring Valley years but gives almost no detail. Her daughter Rose, who was there, doesn't seem to have written about it either. The historical record is thin. Local Spring Valley historians have pieced together timelines and property records. We know the Wilders lived on the family farm. We know they left in October 1891 and briefly tried Florida before returning to De Smet and eventually settling in Missouri. But the lived experience, the daily reality of those 18 months, that's a blank space. The pattern of silence. And blank spaces are interesting, because Laura Ingalls Wilder was not shy about documenting hardship. She wrote about near starvation during the long winter. She wrote about grasshopper plagues. She wrote about Mary going blind. She wrote about poverty and cold and constant moving. So why not Spring Valley? Was it shame? Was it too painful? Was there something about living with Almanzo's family that didn't fit the narrative she wanted to construct? Here's what we do know from the broader historical context. Laura and Almanzo's early marriage was marked by catastrophic loss. In the first 4 years, Laura writes, with brutal honesty, about crop failures, illness, and the death of their infant son. The book ends with their house burning and Laura saying to Almanzo, "We're starting over from the beginning, but I'm not going to let you discourage me. It's a story of resilience, of determination." But the first 4 years ends in late 1889. Spring Valley begins in May 1890. What happened in those months between? What was it like for Laura, who'd spent her entire childhood watching her father fail and move, fail and move, fail and move, to see her own marriage following the same pattern? What was it like to pack up yet another failed homestead and move back east, not as a pioneer heading to free land, but as a defeated couple returning to family for help? What was it like to live with her in-laws? The daughter who shaped the myth. But there's another player in this story we haven't fully examined. Rose Wilder Lane. You know her name if you've studied the Little House books. She was Laura's only surviving child. She was also her mother's editor, collaborator, and, according to some scholars, co-author. Rose was born in De Smet in December 1886. She was 3 years old during the Spring Valley period. She was there. She lived it. And decades later, when her mother sat down to write the Little House books, Rose was the one who shaped them into publishable form. Here's what we know about Rose's role. Laura wrote Pioneer Girl, her original autobiography, in 1929 to 1930. It was rejected by publishers as too dark, too adult, too raw. Rose took that manuscript and helped transform it. She suggested breaking it into episodic children's fiction. She worked with her mother on structure, pacing, dialogue. Some scholars argue she did substantial rewriting. The first Little House book, Little House in the Big Woods, was published in 1932 when Laura was 65. Rose was 46, already an established author herself. Rose Wilder Lane had a fascinating, complicated life. She'd been a telegraph operator, a real estate salesperson, a journalist, and a successful writer of both fiction and non-fiction. By the 1930s, she was politically active, becoming one of the founding voices of American libertarianism. Her 1943 book, The Discovery of Freedom, argued against government intervention and championed individual liberty. She refused to pay income taxes, calling them theft. She railed against the New Deal, against Social Security, against any form of collective governance. This was the woman helping shape the Little House books. And suddenly, some things make more sense. The fierce independence in Laura's stories, the distrust of government, the emphasis on self-reliance and individual achievement, Pa's resistance to taxes and regulation, the framing of homesteading as brave individualism rather than government-subsidized land theft. How much of that was Laura's genuine memory? And how much was Rose's libertarian politics reshaping the past? The collaboration question. Scholars have debated Rose's role for decades. Some argue she was merely an editor, helping her mother polish rough drafts. Others suggest she was essentially a ghostwriter, transforming Laura's memories into publishable prose. The truth is probably somewhere in between. What we know for certain, the manuscripts show extensive editing. Crossed out sections, rewritten passages, structural changes, some in Laura's handwriting, some in Rose's. Rose had editorial control. Letters between mother and daughter show Rose suggesting changes, Laura sometimes agreeing, sometimes pushing back. The political themes intensified over time. The later books contain more libertarian philosophy than the earlier ones. The Long Winter, published in 1940, emphasises self-reliance during government failure. Little Town on the Prairie celebrates individual enterprise. Rose denied being co-author. Publicly, she always said the books were entirely her mother's work. Privately, her diaries tell a different story. Entries about working late on Laura's book, about frustration with the writing process, about her own creative exhaustion. Laura's original Pioneer Girl manuscript is markedly different from the published books, more bitter, more honest about failure, less nostalgic. So, who wrote the Little House books? Laura Ingalls. Wilder's name is on the covers, and she did write them, or at least write the foundation of them, but Rose Wilder Lane shaped them, smoothed them, made them more palatable to publishers and readers, and in the process, she may have imported her own politics, her own interpretations, her own version of what the pioneer experience meant. This matters for our conversation about racism in the books, because if Rose was shaping the narrative, then we have to ask, what did she choose to emphasize? What did she minimize? What political points was she trying to make? The minstrel show scene. Did Laura write that with fond nostalgia, or did Rose decide it needed to stay because it showed the innocent entertainments of simpler times? The no people line about Native Americans, was that Laura's unconscious erasure, or Rose's deliberate emphasis on the land being empty and therefore legitimately available to settlers? The framing of westward expansion as heroic individualism rather than government-subsidized displacement, that sounds very much like Rose's libertarian politics. We can't know for certain. The collaborative process was private. The manuscripts show edits, but not always the reasoning behind them. But we can know this. The Little House books as published are not pure Laura. They're a collaboration. And Rose Wilder Lane brought her own biases, her own politics, her own worldview to that collaboration, which means the racism in the books isn't just Laura's, it's Rose's too. What else is missing? Spring Valley isn't the only gap. Laura's books also gloss over or completely omit the Florida experiment. After Spring Valley, Laura and Almanzo tried to establish themselves in Westville, Florida. In late 1891, they stayed less than a year. Laura hated it. They returned to De Smet in 1892, years of poverty in Mansfield. When they arrived at Rocky Ridge Farm in 1894, they were broke. They lived in a rough cabin while slowly, painfully building up the farm. It took decades. Those decades are barely mentioned. Rose's childhood struggles. Rose was a lonely, intellectually precocious child in rural Missouri. She clashed with her mother. The relationship was complicated. This barely appears in the books. Almanzo's ongoing health issues. The diphtheria left permanent effects. He walked with a limp. He had limited use of one hand. He couldn't do the heavy farm work he'd done as a young man. Laura managed much of the farm operation. This reality is minimized in the book's portrayal of him. Laura's own writing failures. Before the Little House book succeeded, Laura tried to make it as a writer. She wrote for farm journals. She tried poems, essays, opinion pieces. Most were rejected or paid poorly. She didn't achieve real success until her 60s. The financial dependence on Rose. For years, Rose supported her parents financially. She sent money. She paid for improvements to Rocky Ridge. She bailed them out during hard times. This inverts the narrative of pioneer self-sufficiency. All of these realities, failure, dependence, disability, poverty, struggle, are either absent or deeply minimized in the published books. Because the Little House series isn't really about Laura Ingalls Wilder's life. It's about the myth of pioneer America, and myths require editing out the parts that don't fit. Start the mythology machine. And this is where everything connects. Laura and Rose weren't just writing children's books. They were constructing American mythology. The mythology of self-reliant settlers conquering an empty frontier. The mythology of individual achievement triumphing over hardship. The mythology of simpler times when people worked hard, trusted in themselves, and didn't need government help. That mythology required certain stories. It required Charles Ingalls as the heroic Pai, not as the serial failure who couldn't hold on to land or money. It required Laura as the plucky pioneer girl, not as the woman who lived with her in-laws for 18 months, because her marriage had followed her father's pattern of failure. It required the frontier as empty, available land, not as stolen Osage and Dakota territory. It required westward expansion as brave exploration, not as government-subsidized colonization. And it required racism to be either invisible or quaint. Minstrel shows as wholesome entertainment, Native Americans as obstacles or curiosities, not as people being systematically displaced. The mythology couldn't work if those realities were centred. So Laura and Rose made choices. They included the minstrel show but framed it as innocent fun. They included the Kansas land but called it pioneering. They mentioned Native Americans but erased their humanity. And they left out Spring Valley entirely. Because Spring Valley represented failure, dependence, the opposite of the mythology. Going back east to live with family didn't fit the narrative of brave pioneers conquering the frontier. It was retreat, defeat, an admission that the dream hadn't worked, so it had to be erased. The cost of mythology. And this is why the 2018 decision to rename the award matters so much. Because for 77 years, we accepted the mythology as truth. We read the Little House books and believed we were learning accurate history. We thought we were seeing real pioneer life, but we were seeing a carefully constructed myth, one that centred white settlers, erased Indigenous people, romanticised colonisation, and presented racism as nostalgic charm. And generations of children absorbed that myth. They learned that America was built by self-reliant individuals, not by government-subsidised land theft. They learned that the frontier was empty, not stolen. They learned that westward expansion was heroic, not violent. They learned that good men like Pa participated in minstrel shows, and it was just harmless fun. The mythology shaped how millions of Americans understood their history, and the voices that tried to challenge that mythology, the black librarians, the Indigenous educators, the scholars who pointed out the racism, were dismissed as too sensitive, too political, too demanding. Because the mythology was comfortable. It made us feel good about ourselves, about our ancestors, about America. And who wants to give up a good feeling? The question we're finally asking, but now we're asking different questions. We're asking, what did Laura Ingalls Wilder leave out? We're asking, how did Rose Wilder Lane's politics shape the narrative? We're asking, what's missing from the mythology? And those questions lead us back to Spring Valley. Because if Laura deliberately erased 18 months of her life, if she chose to hide her own experience of failure and dependence and retreat, then what else did she erase? What other truths didn't fit the mythology? What other perspectives were silenced to maintain the comfortable narrative? Spring Valley might be a personal story about Laura's marriage and her relationship with her in-laws, or it might be a metaphor for everything the Little House books leave out. All the failure that doesn't fit the success story. All the dependence that doesn't fit the self-reliance myth. All the government support that doesn't fit the individualism narrative. All the Indigenous displacement that doesn't fit the empty frontier lie. All the racism that doesn't fit the wholesome past nostalgia. The mythology required those erasures, and we accepted them for 77 years, until the voices in the margins finally broke through and said, no, this is harm. This erasure matters. These lies have consequences. Where we are now, so here's where we are. We've travelled from 1883 to 2026. We've seen how a single Schoolhouse performance connects to modern debates about censorship and curriculum. We've traced the line from blackface minstrelsy to book bans. We've documented how institutions change slowly, how voices in margins fight to be heard, how Backlash tries to silence progress. We've asked what we owe the next generation. We've grappled with loving flawed things. We've stood in school board meetings and classrooms and libraries, making choices. But there's another story underneath all of this. A story about the woman behind the books. About the real Laura Ingalls Wilder, not the character or the myth. About the years she didn't write about. The experiences she didn't share. The parts of her life that didn't fit the narrative she wanted to construct. That story starts in May 1890, in a small town in Minnesota called Spring Valley, on a farm where Almanzo's parents waited, where a young family, broken, exhausted, grieving, arrived looking for refuge, and where for 18 months something happened. Something important enough that Laura chose never to fully document it. What was it? That's the question we're finally ready to ask, because if we've learned anything from tracing Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy, from the minstrel show, to the award controversy, to the culture war battles, it's this. The stories we don't tell are sometimes more important than the ones we do. The absences reveal as much as the presence. And Laura's silence about Spring Valley is an absence we can no longer ignore. The mythology she and Rose constructed shaped American identity for nearly a century. It taught us who we were, where we came from, what values we should hold. But it was built on erasure. Erasure of failure. Erasure of dependence. Erasure of Indigenous humanity. Erasure of the government support that made homesteading possible. Erasure of the racism that was woven into every aspect of frontier life. And now we're living with the consequences. Because when you build national mythology on erasure, you create a country that's uncomfortable with truth, that's resistant to complexity, that sees any challenge to the comfortable narrative as an attack on identity itself. That's why people are fighting so hard to ban books that tell different stories. That's why librarians are being threatened for stocking Indigenous authors. That's why teachers are afraid to teach honest history, because the mythology is fragile. It can't withstand scrutiny. The moment you start asking what's missing, the whole structure begins to crack. Spring Valley is one crack. The minstrel show scene is another. If the No People line is another. The stolen Osage land is another. Each absence, each erasure, each lie of omission, they add up. And eventually the mythology collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. That's what happened in 2018. The mythology couldn't hold anymore. And that's what's happening now in school boards and libraries and classrooms across the country. We're fighting about whether to let the mythology collapse or to prop it up for one more generation. The people banning books are trying to prop it up. The people fighting for honest history are letting it collapse, and the outcome will determine what kind of country we become. One built on comfortable lies, or one that can handle uncomfortable truths? That's the real question. Not, what will you do? But what kind of truth can you live with? Because Laura Ingalls Wilder's Spring Valley silence isn't just about 18 missing months. It's about everything America has been unwilling to face. And until we're willing to ask what's missing, from her story, from our history, from the mythology we've been taught, we'll keep fighting the same battles, over and over, in school boards, in libraries, in classrooms, in culture wars that never end because they're really about the same fundamental question. Do we want mythology or truth? Laura chose mythology. She and Rose built it carefully, deliberately, over years of collaboration. And it worked. For 77 years it worked. But now we know better. We've heard the voices they erased. We've seen the harm the mythology caused. We've traced the line from a schoolhouse in Smet to book bans in 2026. We can't unknow it. So what comes next isn't just about Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy. It's about ours. What mythology are we building? What are we choosing to erase? Whose voices are we silencing? And when future generations look back at us, will they have to spend 77 years unravelling our comfortable lies? Or will we have the courage to tell the truth while we're still here to tell it? That's the question Spring Valley leaves us with. Not what happened there, but what are we willing to face about ourselves? And the answer starts in February 2026, in a school board meeting, a library, a classroom, your living room, right now. And if you want to know what happened in Spring Valley, what Laura chose to hide, like what those 18 months reveal about the mythology she built, that story is waiting. But first, answer this question. What will you do?